The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch road. When Jake McGrath first heard the crying, he'd been riding the fence line of his property, checking for breaks after the storm that had rolled through the night before when the sound drifted across the wine-soft, desperate, and entirely out of place in the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. Jake pulled his horse to a stop, his weathered hands tightening on the reins as he listened. At 52, he'd spent most of his life alone on this ranch, and human voices were rare enough that they always caught his attention. But this wasn't just any voice, it was young, female, and filled with a pain that made something deep in his chest clench. Following the sound, Jake rode toward the old oak tree that marked the eastern boundary of his land. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days, but also proved to be the beginning of something he'd never expected at this stage of his life. A young woman, barely more than a girl, was tied to the fence post with rough rope that had already begun to chafe her wrists raw. She was dressed in clothes that had seen better days, a torn sundress and worn sneakers that offered little protection against the elements. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and when she looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, Jake saw a mixture of fear, defiance, and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please don't leave me here." Jake was off his horse in an instant, his arthritic joints protesting as he dropped to his knees beside her. His hands, steady despite his age, worked quickly to untie the knots that bound her. "Easy there, darlin'," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of a man who'd spent years talking to spooked horses. "You're safe now. I'm not going anywhere." As the ropes fell away, the girl, because that's what she was, despite what her ID would later reveal, collapsed against him. Jake caught her easily, his arms strong from decades of ranch work, and for a moment they stayed like that, an unlikely pair in the middle of nowhere. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jake asked gently. "Sarah," she managed through chattering teeth. "Sarah Chen. Well, Sarah Chen, I'm Jake McGrath, and this is my land you're on. Can you tell me who did this to you?" Sarah's face crumpled, and fresh tears began to flow. My father. He was drunk again, and I tried to stop him from driving. He got angry and said I was just like my mother, worthless and in the way. He tied me up and left me here. Said maybe a night in the cold would teach me some respect." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "When was this?" "Yesterday evening," Sarah whispered. "I've been here all night." The fury that rose in Jake's chest was unlike anything he'd felt in years. He'd never been one for violence, but the thought of any man leaving a child, and 18, or not, she was still just a child tied up and helpless, made his hands shake with rage. But Sarah needed care, not anger, so Jake pushed down his fury and focused on what mattered. "Can you stand?" he asked. Sarah nodded, though her legs were unsteady when Jake helped her to her feet. She'd been in the same position for hours, and circulation was just beginning to return to her limbs. "My truck's just over that ridge," Jake said, pointing toward a dirt road barely visible in the distance. "Think you can make it that far if I help you?" "I think so," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. Jake studied her for a moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives. "Tell you what, I'm going to put you up on my horse, and I'll walk alongside. That'll be easier on those legs of yours." Before Sarah could protest, Jake had lifted her onto his mare, Buttercup, who stood patient and still as if she understood the gravity of the situation. Jake took the reins and began the slow walk back toward his truck, one hand on the bridle and the other ready to steady Sarah if she started to fall. As they walked, Jake found himself studying the girl out of the corner of his eye. She was small and delicate, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, Asian from her mother's side, he guessed, and something else from her father's. There was a fragility to her that made Jake's protective instincts flare, but also a strength in the set of her jaw that suggested she was tougher than she looked. "How long has he been drinking?" Jake asked gently. "Since Mom died, 5 years ago," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first it was just weekends, then every night. This past year, it's been bad, and you've been taking care of yourself all this time." Sarah nodded. "I work at the diner in town after school. Graduated last month. I was saving up to leave, but he found my money and—" She trailed off, but Jake could fill in the blanks. They reached Jake's truck, an old Ford that had seen better decades, but still ran reliably. Jake helped Sarah down from the horse and into the passenger seat, then loaded Buttercup into the trailer, hitched to the back. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as Jake started the engine. "My place," Jake said simply. "You need food, medical attention, and a safe place to rest. We'll figure out the rest later." Sarah was quiet for the 20-minute drive to Jake's ranch house, but Jake could feel her watching him. He supposed she had every right to be wary she didn't know him from Adam, and her recent experience with the men in her life hadn't exactly been positive. Jake's house was a modest 2-story structure that had been built in the 1940s and lovingly maintained ever since. It sat in a grove of cottonwoods that provided shade and shelter from the wind, surrounded by the various outbuildings that made up a working cattle ranch. "It's not much," Jake said as he helped Sarah out of the truck, "but it's home." Sarah looked around with wide eyes. After years of living in a rundown trailer with an abusive drunk, Jake's neat, well-maintained property probably looked like paradise. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Jake led her up the front steps and into the house. The interior was clean, but clearly masculine leather furniture, sturdy wood tables, and walls decorated with old photographs and Western art. It smelled like coffee and leather and something indefinably comforting. "Bathrooms upstairs, second door on the right," Jake said. "Why don't you get cleaned up while I make us some breakfast? There's clean towels in the linen closet, and I think there might be some clothes that'll fit you." "Whose clothes?" Sarah asked. Jake's face grew distant. "My daughter's. She would have been about your age now." Something in his tone told Sarah not to ask any more questions, so she simply nodded and headed upstairs. While Sarah was in the bathroom, Jake busied himself in the kitchen, cooking eggs and bacon and trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. He'd lived alone for 15 years, ever since his wife and daughter had been killed in a car accident. He'd grown accustomed to silence, to solitude, to the predictable rhythms of ranch life. Taking in a stranger, a teenage girl, no less, went against every instinct he'd developed for self-preservation. But when he'd seen Sarah tied to that fence post, looking so small and scared and helpless, something had awakened in him that he'd thought was dead and buried. The protective instinct that had once driven him to check under his daughter's bed for monsters and walk her to the school bus every morning had roared back to life with a vengeance. Sarah came downstairs 40 minutes later, transformed. Jake's daughter's clothes were a little big on her, but the jeans and flannel shirt were clean and warm. She'd braided her damp hair back from her face, revealing delicate features and those remarkable storm gray eyes. "Feel better?" Jake asked, setting a plate of food in front of her. "Much," Sarah said, though she eyed the food uncertainly. I can't pay you for this." "Who asked you to pay?" Jake said gruffly, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "Eat." Sarah ate with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Jake watched her, noting how she ate every bite and kept glancing at him as if waiting for him to snatch the plate away. "When's the last time you had a good meal?" he asked. Sarah flushed. "A while. Dad spent most of the grocery money on beer." Jake's jaw tightened again, but he kept his voice level. "Well, you'll eat regular meals here." "Here?" Sarah looked up sharply. "You mean I can stay?" "For now," Jake said carefully, "until we figure out what comes next." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like tears of relief rather than pain. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to me. You don't even know me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the pasture where his cattle grazed. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. "Emma. She was about your age. When she died, I like to think that if she'd ever been in trouble, someone would have helped her." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked softly. "Car accident. Drunk driver hit them coming home from Emma's piano recital. Killed her and my wife instantly." Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. "That was 15 years ago." "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. Jake nodded. "Me too. But that's not your burden to carry. Point is, I've got plenty of room here, and I could use the company. If you want to stay, you can stay, but there'll be rules." Sarah sat up straighter. What kind of rules? Nothing unreasonable. You'll help with chores around the ranch. I'm not running a charity here. You'll finish your education, whether that's college or trade school or whatever you want to do. And you'll check in with me if you're going somewhere, so I don't worry.